You up. Yeah. Please.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much to Corey for creating this opportunity for me to share this project with you this evening. And thank you all so much for coming out. It's an honor, and I'm really excited and enthusiastic to share this material with you, so thank you. Corey was mentioning that I'm here because of the studios of Key West, so I'm also very grateful to them for the month-long residency that brings me here, and also to Stephanie Hunter, the editor-in-chief at the University Press of Florida, whose belief in this project made it possible. So the project, Tears and Flowers, A Poet of Migration in Old Key West, is a bilingual facing page edition of a collection of 96 poems by Feliciano Castro, first published in Spanish right here on Southard Street in 1918. I want to thank my collaborator on this project, translator and scholar Dr. Rai Johnson. An assistant professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University, Bloomington, Dr. Johnson's the translator not only of this collection, but also Because I Want to See the Sea, a collection by the Galician poet Rosalia de Castro. And she's the author of the scholarly monograph Women and Water, Fluxes of the Feminine in the 19th Century, which is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press, and it's really terrific. Keep an eye out for that. Without Rai's scholarly discernment, passionate commitment, and brilliant translations, this project wouldn't exist, and I will be forever grateful. I'm also grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for a grant that helped support the publication of our book, and for the month-long Summer Institute in Tampa, where Rai and I met. I want primarily, though, to thank my grandfather, Feliciano Castro, for writing this extraordinary poetry collection, Lágrimas y flores, and my father, Líbano Castro, who cared enough about Tears and Flowers to keep it among his things until he died. Its restoration contributes to a fuller picture of Key West's rich literary and cultural history. Like many people, I grew up knowing very little about how my family's personal history intersected with larger capital H history, how our own little story intersected with the larger geopolitical world. What I did know was that my family was Cuban American. I grew up visiting my grandparents at their house at 311 Elizabeth Street, just a few blocks from here, and playing with my cousins who lived in Newtown. But when I was born, my grandfather, Feliciano Castro, was already 75 years old. At home, he spoke nothing but Spanish, and he mostly sat silently and alone, listening to Spanish language radio. As a fifth-generation Floridian born in Miami, but who grew up primarily in England and West Virginia, I knew only English. He died when I was 14 in 1982. I didn't know then that he had once been an ambitious young poet. I didn't know he had been a lector, or loud reader, at the Gato Cigar-Factory, which you can still visit, of course, on Simonton Street. I didn't even know what a lector was. Until I was over 50 years old myself at that Summer Institute in Tampa, I did not know that Key West had been, for decades in the 19th century, the offshore rebel base of Cuba's anti-colonial, explicitly anti-racist rebellion against Spain, which was a rich, exciting movement that thrilled me and intrigued me so much that I was moved to write One Brilliant Flame, the historical thriller, to try to bring greater public attention to that moment, which I had never encountered before. And so that novel is set in 1886 at the time of the Great Fire that destroyed the city. I didn't know that my great-grandfather, Juan Perez Rollo, had published a newspaper here that supported the cause of a free Cuba. So I'm very grateful to University of Tampa professors James Lopez and Dennis Ray, whom some of you may know, who founded the NEH Summer Institute, where Ryan and I met. But let me begin in 1892 in Galicia, in the northwest corner of Spain. It was one of Spain's two most poverty-stricken autonomous communities. It was there where Feliciano Castro Verde was born to a struggling farm family in Lugo. At 9 years old, he was taken by his godfather, Rosendo Lopez, across the Atlantic Ocean to Old Havana, where Lopez raised him as his own son and where young Feliciano fell passionately in love with Cuba. In 3 verses of his long poem, Cuba, included in the book, he writes about this wrenching and confusing experience of migration, of being dislocated from Spain and from his family as a child, and how he fell in love with the lush beauties of his new home. I'll put his original verses in Spanish on the screen and then read you Ry Johnson's English translations. So if you're fluent in Spanish, you can hear the music of his poems in your mind, and if you're not, you can still see where the rhymes, where the end rhymes are and how the poems are structured. And Ry's translation, my cradle was rocked by the breezes of the Cantabrian, and on looking to the light, my eyes saw the light of a Spanish sun. But one day, very young, one sad and gloomy afternoon, I launched myself like a tender bird who, daring in his flights, roams in pursuit of a fantasy, of a patria, or homeland, in roseate glow. Ripped from the arms of my idolatrized Spain, with my mind's eye I saw another patria all of love, and propelled by the waves of a sea that roars in anger, I went on paddling, and in the arms of an enamored mother, I found myself like a drop of dew on a flower. Cuba was that patria that welcomed me with caresses. Cuba and her caresses were the murmur of the palms. Another patria, just like mine, to hold me close in her arms. On leaving, perhaps forever, a mother who adored me. In the arms of another mother, kind shelter I came to find. 5 years later, at the age of 14, Feliciano was sent by his godfather to Rome, to the Pontifical Spanish College of St. Joseph, a Jesuit seminary designed to train young men for the priesthood. There he would receive a classical education and become fluent in Italian and French, something I never knew growing up. Though he did not become a priest, he did love his education, particularly in literature, science, and history. In his 11-quatrain poem, La Escuela, or School, he vaunts the great value of formal education as a faro luminoso, or luminous lighthouse, a metaphor that could well have been influenced by his experience here. He calls it a sublime anchor, a shelter. He praises institutions of knowledge as places of refuge and intellectual salvation. At 19, his education complete, he returned to Cuba. But his godfather passed away unexpectedly, leaving him with no inheritance. Alone in Havana, he married a young woman in May of 1914, just a few weeks before World War I exploded across Europe. But the marriage lasted only a year before they divorced, and in 1916 he left to make a fresh start in Tampa. There he wrote for Bohemia, but this paid only the equivalent of $300 a month in today's terms. He could not sustain himself. In 1917, orphaned, divorced, jobless, and broke, he boarded a steamship bound homeward for Cuba. When it stopped briefly in Key West, he disembarked to have a meal. In 1917, Key West still occupied, as it had for decades, one point on the so-called Tobacco Triangle comprising three cities, Key West, Havana, and Tampa. Together they formed the core of a global cigar industry that produced hundreds of millions of cigars each year. This booming industry and Key West's deepwater port made it one of Florida's most prosperous towns. These are some of the sources that we use in our book, so thank you to those authors. By 1915, 29 cigar factories operated here in Key West, and cigar workers were among the highest paid laborers in the state. Residents of Key West were also highly mobile and cosmopolitan. Even before the Florida Overseas Railroad connected the small island to the mainland in 1912, steamships ran regularly on routes that linked Key West not only to Havana and Tampa, but also to New Orleans and New York. Cigar factory workers, moreover, even those who may not have been literate themselves, had access to a university-level education in current events, political theory, and literature due to the lector, or loud reader tradition, in which a professional orator, usually but not always a man, would read from a high platform the news of the day. He would also read cutting-edge and radical political theory, such as the work of Karl Marx and anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, and great humanist novels including Don Quixote, Les Miserables, and the works of Charles Dickens. In the evenings, lectores would meet in cafes to debate the political issues of the day, while crowds gathered around them to listen. So workers were keenly aware of strikes, labor protests, and liberation movements around the world, as well as Latin American, Spanish, and U.S. politics more generally. Thus, informed and inspired by this auditory education, cigar workers in Key West often went on strike themselves. Well paid due to successful union organizing, and both contributing to and benefiting from local Cuban mutual aid societies here on the island that provided high-quality health care and schools that were bilingual and racially integrated, so pretty extraordinary for the time period. Cigar rollers considered themselves an elite group of powerful, skilled artisans who absorbed and vigorously debated the ideas and controversies of their moment. It's essential to note, moreover, that the three cities of the Tobacco Triangle had also been politically intertwined for decades by their anti-colonial, revolutionary commitment to liberate Cuba from Spain's imperial power. Since the 1860s, and some date it even a little earlier, Key West had been a haven for Cuban independence rebels fleeing the chaos of Revolutionary War on their home soil. In the safe haven offered by Key West, they raised funds and gathered munitions for the cause of Cuba Libre. Before his death on the battlefield in Cuba, revolutionary poet José Martí visited Key West and Tampa from New York to give political speeches and connect with the Cuban rebel community here. And of course, if you go to La Tira on Duval Street, you can see a balcony from which he spoke. He commented that he found the rebels of Key West to be the most radically anti-colonial and anti-racist of all Cuban emigre communities in the United States. The cigar workers of Key West actively shaped contemporary discourse too by pounding their chavetas, small cigar knives, upon the wooden work tables, their form of applause, which signaled to the lectores their approval and endorsement of particular passages from the reading. Because many of the lectores wrote for the international Cuban press, as well as the 20 daily and weekly Spanish language newspapers that were published here in Key West between 1880 and 1918, they could swiftly incorporate the reactions of the workers into their own arguments, capturing the mood of the masses. Spanish language newspapers printed in Havana were read by the wealthy Cuban emigre community in New York City. Because of this rapid feedback loop, political ideas circulated rapidly and freely among manual laborers and intellectual elites, and between Key West and large urban centers. So despite its small size and remote location, Key West was a center of industry, commerce, and politics, a Caribbean entrepot, a link between Havana's tobacco wealth and the United States. In 1898, after the United States entered what had already been a 3 decades-long Cuban independence struggle against Spain, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending what was misleadingly called the Spanish-American War, a name that erases Cuba altogether. But even after the treaty was signed and Spain was expelled, Cubans in Key West were fearful, as Jose Marti had been, that the United States would come to dominate Cuba both politically and economically, fears that in the early years of the 20th century were already proving very well justified. And if you're interested, chapters 13 through 18 of Ada Ferrer's outstanding volume, Cuba, An American History, offer an excellent overview of this political and economic domination of Cuba by the U.S. in the early 1900s. Really fascinating and gorgeously written. This then was the larger context that shaped Feliciano Castro's arrival in Key West in 1917 without prospects, without a plan. When he overheard at the restaurant where he was dining that a local cigar factory was seeking a lector, he had nothing to lose. He auditioned and he got the job. He was 24 years old. In Key West, his life turned around. As a lector at the cigar factory, one of Key West's, at the Gato factory, one of Key West's oldest cigar manufacturers, and in 1917, its largest, he read the daily news aloud, as well as novels, amazing novels like The Count of Monte Cristo and Don Quixote. Because he earned over $2,700 a month in today's terms, a huge increase from his Tampa salary, and his shifts were only 3 hours long, though physically exhausting. Of course, you can imagine, like, I am here using a microphone to speak to you, but imagine trying to project to 500 busily working people while, no air conditioning. So very exhausting labor, but short. So anyway, his 3-hour shifts left him time for other pursuits. And so he wrote journalism. I meant for you to be looking at his face all that time. Sorry about that. So that was him? Okay, hi. Yeah, hi, puppy. Okay, all right. So there's Don Quixote, and he wrote journalism for Florida, a weekly newspaper, and he was befriended by its publisher, Juan Perez Rollo, an older Cuban emigre. Perez Rollo had arrived here in Key West from Havana in 1869 as a child with his siblings and widowed mother, fleeing the bloodshed of the 10 Years' War against Spain. So the 10 Years' War was the first, it started in 1868. So Perez Rollo, my great-grandfather, married and raised a family here on the island. Lifelong Cuban patriots, he and his wife Antonia, who wrote a weekly column for Florida, warmed to the young Feliciano's erudition and zeal for the cause of Cuban liberty. Perez Rollo took him under his wing, taught him the printing trade, and invited him to purchase a half-interest in his press, Taller Tipográfico, on Southard Street. In 1918, Taller Tipográfico published Feliciano Castro's Lágrimas y flores, Tears and Flowers, a collection of 96 formal poems that capture a lost world of politics and romance. The collection's direct and simple title, Lágrimas y flores, Tears and Flowers, indicates its clear two-part structure and thematic organization. Of the 96 formal poems in Lágrimas y flores, 60 are sonnets, and they include 13 different variations on the Spanish sonnet form. The 42 poems of the first section, Lágrimas or Tears, focus primarily on politics, patriotism, and pain. They avow the poet's deeply felt pride, a political and sentimental loyalty that embraces both his home country of Spain and his adopted nation, Cuba. The first three poems of Lágrimas, My Mother and My Flag, The Soul of Martí, and Tears, establish the moral identity of the implied poet as being firmly rooted in a twinned devotion to his mother and his patria via the symbol of the flag, and specifically both the flag of Spain, his country of origin, and of Cuba, his beloved adopted home. The Lágrimas poems also explore the nostalgic grief of migration and exile, including the loss of family and homeland, the triumphs and suffering of history and war, the virtues of patriotism, education, and erudition, and the perils, both literal and metaphorical, of the sea. In this vein, the poems in Lágrimas locate the collection firmly within the Cuban-American literary tradition of exile, rendering heart-wrenching moments of familial loss, as well as the loss of homeland. Several of the poems express a kind of anguished longing for romantic companionship and domestic happiness, as well as a sense of fearful despair at the possibility that true closeness and safe harbor will never be found. A sequence of 7 explicitly political poems, some of which are quite long, deploys an encyclopedic welter of specific historical details and names patriotic Cuban independence heroes from Céspedes, Agramontes, and Aguilar to Martí, asserting a kind of Hispanic Latinx patriotic grandeur, both flourishing the poet's erudition via his extensive knowledge of history and establishing his political commitment to the Cuban liberation struggle. By invoking the Cuban and Spanish communities of Tampa and Key West, he remaps our understanding of how these cities were linked in a transnational solidarity that connected and unified all those who were galvanized by the cause of Cuba Libre. The symbolic importance of the sea voyage, too, is evident in his metaphors. Several poems, including A Blue Patria, so in that one it's really interesting. He's talking about the ocean itself as a homeland. Makes sense given his transatlantic journeys and the many times he crossed the Florida Straits during his lifetime. A Blue Patria and The Fisherman, they gesture toward this metaphor. And his poem, The Little Boat and the Soul, spells it out explicitly, emphasizing the isolation and vulnerability of the small craft against the ominous waves. The 54 poems in Flores, or Flowers, the second section of the book, take a significant turn, celebrating the beauties, delights, and comforts of the world of women, describing feminine charms through the language of floral symbolism. Though initially seeming quite chaste to our 21st century ear, the poems use delicately erotic imagery that springs from the tropical settings the poet knew well. A woman's body sways like a palm tree. A drop of dew on the petal of a flower symbolizes feminine arousal and desire. Several of the poems have titles that are boldly and directly passionate, such as your eyes, your mouth, and your caress. To title this section Flowers and focus so intently upon floral imagery was both to participate in a late 19th century poetic and painterly convention that closely linked women with beautiful blossoms. So those are some cigar labels there too. And also to affirm Castro's connection to his new homeland, Florida. Twice he uses the adjective Florida, Florida meaning flowery or in bloom, and the poems employ a variety of flowers, roses, polyanthes, irises, and lilies, to signify the loveliness, the erotic allure, and sometimes the moral purity of women. Roses are mentioned dozens of times, and the word flower itself is used over 100 times in the collection. Particularly interesting to historians or history buffs might be the way that Castro's verses help us reconstruct the social world of Key West during the period, because they praise and describe the beauty of dozens of specific particular women whom he honors by name in the poem's titles or dedication. 43 of the poems are dedicated to specific women. And if you look carefully at the surnames, you can see that they fall roughly into 9 different family groupings, which is very interesting as well. For example, 2 of the women, Consuelito Rivero and Mariana Salgado, were members of the Cuba Society, a theater company here in Key West. Feliciano's 11-quatrain poem, Cubans, Carry On, was composed and delivered in honor of the founding of the Cuba Society in 1917, and he dedicates poems in the collection to 6 of its members, not only Rivero and Salgado, who likely acted in the plays, but also director Francisco Pineda, playwright and critic Octavio Monterese, Santiago Garcia, and Rogelio Micheli, apparently a very good friend, for they traveled to Havana together, and he was a Key West anarchist editor. One of the most provocative and seductive poems in the Flores section is titled In the Theater, and it's set in the theater. Another is called At the Dance. I'll share a few excerpts of his long poem that's dedicated to Consuelito Rivero, the actress who was in the Cuba Society Theater Company. Here's the first stanza. So it's called Don't Forget My Songs, and here's Ry Johnson's translation. Lady of my daydreams, seductive image, more lovely than the divine rays of the dawn, exquisite ensemble of sharply drawn dreams. Don't forget my songs of joys and of loves. Listen to them, sincere and tender, like flowers that burst out fervently from my very heart. I'll skip ahead now to stanza 5. And here's Ry's translation. I long to drink the pure light of a glance, of the fire that a caress from my beloved would give me, the life from her lips, to breathe again her breath, on hearing her voice to weave lovely songs, with her to repeat them, to always dream of them, to sleep with their caresses as a placid lullaby. And here's the 7th stanza. And Ry's translation. I should like to watch over the sweet sleep of my beloved, her silent hours of love and dreams, through pleasurable nights with joyful dawns, to feel on my lips the fever of her kisses, to carry them forever printed on my soul, and of her soul and mine to form a single being. So, as you can see or hear, while the poems are not at all salacious from our 21st century perspective, their allusions are very intimate and suggestive for that time period. A cultural historian can deduce a great deal about the early 20th century social world of Cuban Key West from Lágrimas y Flores. A revealing outline of the culture and its circulation of ideas emerges from Castro's many dedications of poems to individuals he knew, including all those ladies, and writers he admired, in addition to his headnotes designating the institutions and events for which he wrote poems on special occasions. For example, his 15-stanza poem, The Cry of Yara, about the foundational incident of Cuba's anti-colonial rebellion against Spain in 1868, was composed by him and read by him at the San Carlos Institute in Key West, which, of course, not this building, because the book was published in 1918. The building that he would have read it at was destroyed, I think, by a hurricane in 1919, and this is the version that was rebuilt in 1924. But in any case, the San Carlos Institute, the spirit of the San Carlos Institute, remained constant, and it had served for decades already as the hub of Cuban cultural, social, and political life here on the island. And of course, you can visit it on Duval Street today. And if you have not yet done so, I highly urge you to do so. It's utterly fascinating. These dedications of the poems also demonstrate Feliciano Castro's connections to a web of writers in Latin America, including Canarian Cuban poet and journalist Arturo Doreste, Honduran poet and statesman Salvador Turcios, and Cuban poets Dominguez Perez and J.M. Subirats. For this book, we have carefully annotated all of these individuals and institutions, and Appendix 1 of the volume offers a detailed accounting of the people who surrounded Castro and their institutions and their literary productions. Tears and Flowers, then, provides not only almost 100 newly recovered beautiful poems of the era, but also provides new insight into the social architecture of the interlocking Cuban and Hispanic exile and migrant communities of the early 20th century in Tampa and Key West. After Lágrimas y Flores appeared in 1918, Feliciano continued to publish individual poems and essays. In 1920, he married one of the daughters of the Perez Rollo family, Sofia, to whom one of the love sonnets in the Flores section is dedicated, and they had a son, Mario. Tragically, Sofia died in childbirth with another child who also did not survive. Perhaps shattered by grief, Feliciano Castro would never write another book. He eventually married Sofia's younger sister, Virginia, who would become my grandmother, and with whom he had a daughter, Leticia, and another son, Libano, who would become my father. In 1934, he became the administrator of the Spanish-language newspaper Cayohueso, Key West, and in 1937, he was unanimously elected to the social club Martí here in Key West. In 1943, he was installed as the secretary of the Dr. Felix Varela Masonic Lodge, named after a key founder of the Cuban independence movement. The following year, 1944, after having rented various apartments since his arrival in Key West, he purchased the two-story house on Elizabeth Street, where he and Virginia had two more daughters, Lourdes and Linda. Lourdes, my Aunt Lou, as she went by, she was the librarian at the Key West High School for some years, so in case you knew her. At the end of the driveway of the house stood a small building that housed the Florida Press, which Castro founded and ran for the next several decades with the help of his sons Mario and Libano. He died in 1982 and is buried in the Key West Cemetery. 20 years later, my father died, leaving among his effects 2 books. His grandfather Juan Perez Rolo's memoir, Mis Recuerdos, which has not yet been published in English. It's a memoir of the whole period from 1869 until the mid-20s of Key West, of what it was like to come here as a boy and to watch the Cuban independence community here and be part of it. And his own father's book of poetry. So we offer our annotated bilingual edition of the sole extant copy of Lágrimas y Flores in the hope that it might become a rich scholarly resource for anyone interested in developing a fuller picture of Floridian literary production in the early 20th century, and a fuller picture of the anti-colonial, anti-racist, pro-labor, left-wing Cuban community that flourished for decades here in Key West. By invoking Cuba, Spain, and the Cuban and Spanish communities of the Floridian tobacco cities of Tampa and Key West in his poetry and dedications, Feliciano Castro helps to remap our cultural and geopolitical understanding of the period. And on an island so well known for its illustrious Anglo-American authors writing in English, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, Elizabeth Bishop, Tennessee Williams, and so many more, Feliciano Castro's exquisite love sonnets and sophisticated political poems, published right here in Spanish, complicate and enrich our understanding of the literary heritage of Key West. Thank you all so much.